Thank you all for joining us. This is SOMMSCHOOL with Will Costello, Master Sommelier, and today we have a great friend joining me. This is Maximilian Max Kast, although in my world, you are Maxabillion. He is a Master Sommelier and works for Broadbent Selections, here to talk about how you look at blind tasting in the real world. But to start it here, I wanted to ask you if you would regale us with your story of your blind tasting flight that you passed for the Master Sommelier exam. And I know there's a couple versions, so maybe just the final one.
All right, yeah, so the final one was in December of 2018. And that flight was, what do you want to know about it specifically?
Tell us your process, what you went through, because the whole goal of this is taking that experience that so many people build up in their mind, like the Master Sommelier, or in some cases the Advanced Sommelier, passing the tasting. And really, I mean, that happened one time for 20, I can't even remember how many minutes, it's 26 minutes, it's 25 minutes, 25 minutes. And that we have 364 other days of the year where those skills shouldn't be lost. So I kind of want to know about your 25 minutes so that we can extrapolate that out to the rest of the world.
Yeah, so in that 25 minutes, I mean, that was a special scenario, given that was the retesting that came after the whole debacle of that September of 2018. So there's a lot of pressure going into it, right? And there's a lot of emotions. So it was really the ultimate thing going in there was having equanimity in kind of my composure and being calm and letting everything just kind of speak to me, right? Being receptive to what's in the glass. And when I went in there with that sort of that mentality, the wines, I was like, look for everything for what they are. Don't let your mind put anything that's not there into it, and really just describe all the wines for what they are. And I'm an instinctual taster, and some people that doesn't work for them, but for me,
how many instinctual tastings did you get on your flight? Like, how many did you have to work through, and how many did you just like instinct?
I had to work through five. No, I had to work through one, and I instinctually went through five. But you still break down, you know what I mean?
Of course.
You still are like, all right, you're still asking questions, and you're still breaking things down, and you have that deductive method. And the deductive method is super important when you get to those points where you are basically where you have no idea, because those do come, that you're sitting there and you're like, oh crap. And they're like, well, all right, let's really make it work and really get into the mindset, and let's get rid of what this can't be, right? But the most important thing that I took from that and all the other times I passed blind tasting is that it's not just about getting the grapes right. It's about describing the wine. It's about understanding how the wines are made, and using those ability and those skills that we spent so much time training ourselves to get better in all aspects of what you do. So now I'm not working in restaurants anymore, obviously, but when I was working in restaurants, blind tasting and my training in blind tasting was one of the most useful things as far as being a purchaser of wine, because it made me get out of my own head, and instead of being like, oh, I'm going to buy all the cool stuff that I want to put on the list and people are going to like it, I'll be like, hey, I'm not going to sit down at the end of tonight and drink this wine, but it's really well made, and there's people out there who are going to love it, and I can, with confidence, knowing that it's well made, put it on my list and be proud of having it on there, even though it's not a wine that I don't drink. It's not a wine that I drink.
For my blind tasting that I passed the MS, mine was in 2015. I think I had my 5-year anniversary just a few days back. I think it was on the 21st of May. I also had that instinctual opportunity in my flight. I mean, one of the wines was like an 06 or 08, super solid Premier Cru or maybe Grand Cru Chablis from a great producer like Dovisat or Ravenel. Like pick it up, smell it. I'm super stoked to have it. And for me, it's something that I love because I love those wines. There was a residual sugar wine that I recognized to have a little bit of oxidation, lower acidity, and no floral aromatics. So I'm like backed into it. Yeah, it's got to be Pinot Gris. Picked up the Gruner and went, thank goodness that's Gruner. Didn't even have to think about it twice.
Yeah.
But my reds were a little more difficult. Wine number 4, I started calling Brunello di Montalcino, realizing that it had oak on it much, much later. And, you know, Brunello di Montalcino with new oak is not a classic. But the funny thing is, at a restaurant, wine number 6, at least in my flight, was for sure, and you know as well as everybody else, we never know what our flight is when we pass, right? We just know that we passed. But I can tell you, if that wasn't 96 Barolo or Barbaresco, I don't know what it could possibly be, because I poured 5 cases of 96 Odero Barolo every single night on the Grand Cru pairing at Twist. Every single night I tasted 96 Barolo. And I kid you not, if that was not 96 Barolo, I don't know what the hell it was, because it was the only thing it could be. And, you know, I remember this, and you'll remember it, and so many people who take their certified or their advanced or their master exam will remember those flights that they pass and usually forget the ones. But the reason that I wanted to talk to you today is because there's so many more ways in the world that we can use our blind tasting abilities, and that's deductive abilities, to make our lives more enriched. And so you already brought it up a little bit, but I want you to go a little bit more in depth in the following areas. And the first one is about work, right? Being a sommelier, buying wines for a restaurant, but you can also, of course, talk about, now that you're on the import side, how you can add that to your sales ability, right? Knowing your book, but also how that compares to other wines of the world, but also, you know, getting that back to restaurants, your family. You know, my wife is not a big fan of licorice, black licorice. Well, what else in the world tastes like black licorice? Anise, right? Fennel bulbs, tarragon, all of these things that, you know, are, if you didn't have the ability to deduce their flavors, I might make a tarragon and roasted carrots for dinner, and she might not eat it and push it to the side, and she'd say, oh, it's fine. And I might not go, oh, hey, it's the black licorice. So those kinds of things that we can use. And I'd love you to start going back deeper into your restaurant experience and how that specifically helped you build your list, but also find the right wines for guests.
So yeah, there's a lot there, right? So number one, building lists, I covered a little bit, right? I got into more about the winemaking and the quality of the wine, less about what I wanted to have on the list. Because number one, that's better for business, because you want to have wines that people want to buy. And then number two, it kind of, all of this is in some point getting rid of your ego, right? And to enable to offer hospitality, you have to get rid of your wants a little bit and kind of make people, bring people more in. And by having wines that you won't necessarily drink, but you know are well made, that helps with getting people, being more inclusive to people. An area that it really helped was in talking with chefs and talking with, as far as food and wine pairing across the board, because you break apart your language of flavor the same way that they break away their language of flavor, and the way that they put ingredients together to create a dish. And actually some of the people that I've mentored and worked with, who are right away some of the best blind tasters, are people who got their start in kitchens, from my experience, because that whole, they have the vocabulary, but they're also used to breaking flavor down, right? And they're used to talking about acid, talking about sweetness and texture and body. So that really helped me my working, particularly when I was at the Farrington House for 10 years, working with the chef and really honing in our ability to pair food and wine well. And then since we had lots, say, all right, so there we had like a vegetarian tasting menu, chef's tasting menu, 3-course a la carte, 4-course a la carte. You had all these different options. We offered wine pairings for them all. And then inevitably, we're like, all right, so we have these guests who are doing the vegetarian tasting menu. And they're like, we only drink red wines. Right. And you're like, oh crap. Yeah. So that in those scenarios, again, you get it into looking at what's the texture of the dish, what are the aromatics on the dish, what red wines am I going to put with those, knowing all the different things that I work on every day, practicing and blind tasting. And I found those really to be some of the coolest like aha moments. Was when I would have those nights and working with those customers and trying to make them happy and trying to work out those pairings, doing things that I would have doing pairings I would have never tried before, but which actually using that deductive method, actually putting things together and putting flavor profiles together that worked.
I had one of those dishes specifically where we had a foie gras dish with must have been like a mushroom consomme, something like that on the bottom with choucroute and sausages. Like it's one of those dishes where—
a rich dish, man.
Yeah, and one of those dishes where you have people who say, oh, can I have a glass of Sauternes, please? And you're like, this is not a Sauternes dish here. And my ability to deductively taste, to recognize flavor profiles, acidity, all brought me back to the understanding, okay, I know what they're asking for. They want what everyone has always said is a great pairing, foie gras and sweet wine. But what are they really looking for? They're looking for something with a little bit of residual sugar. So now I have this whole world of residual sugar wines. They're looking for something that has richness and texture as well, just like botrytis brings into the conversation. But I need something that's more savory than sweet. So I ended up typically landing on something like a 15 to 18 grams per liter, like Oloroso, or sometimes even cream style sherry, where, yeah, it made them happy because they got the sweetness. They recognize, oh yeah, it doesn't have to be that, but it all came from my ability to go, okay, where do you get texture from? Texture comes from alcohol. So clearly higher alcohol wines have this thing involved, right? Because when people think of Sauternes, they think of sweet wine, but there are some versions that are 14.5% alcohol, right?
Exactly. Yep.
And so you think about texture and you think about acidity, and we know Palomino typically has relatively low acid. So when we're talking about mushrooms, it's going to harmonize with the consomme. It's going to match the texture of fattiness of a sausage and the fattiness of the foie gras. And it's such an interesting way to take your ability to deductively taste and to, if somebody put a blind glass in front of you, figure it out and apply that to the real world. And one of the questions that I really was interested too, because you had such a great list at Farrington House, did your reps and the people selling you wine know how to bring you a wine if you used tasting terminology? For example, if you said, we have a 4-course vegetarian menu, there's a lot of endive and a lot of, radicchio and these kind of things. Can you bring me phenolic wines? Would they know that? Or did you need to say, I'd like to try some white Hermitage, I'd like to try some Southern Rhone, can you bring me some Assyrtiko, some Gruner Veltliner and all of that?
It was kind of a mix of both. Really, I've always, I've been lucky to have when I was a buyer, lots of really great reps who were like, we really communicated quite well. And people they would always come in and look at the menu, and they always were well versed in what was going on in the menu, which is one of the things that like is so key for great if you are a wine rep, or and they would always bring in things that they had a perception they would work out on the menu, right? And then like they would run it by me ahead of time, and I would go through and taste. But then that goes into another thing too. And you're in those situations, I always took as many opportunities as possible to taste, right? Because you are, that is how you develop your palate. So, I mean, within reason, you're not sitting tasting like 100 wines every day, but I would make a number of appointments, and I'd make sure it's worth people's time, just as they would make sure it's worth my time, and put things that they know that I would like, right? But it's another kind of going in and going away from restaurants for a second. The area that I found that it really, all of this has worked out really well for me, is gaining a very intimate relationship with the producers that I represent on a flavor profile wise, right? So we represent tons of iconic producers, like Tyrrell's, for instance, right? When people are like, oh yeah, like people who don't know Hunter Valley Semillon, they're like, oh, a Semillon from Australia? Is that like really rich and oaky? And like, I'm like, no, actually, it's about one of the leanest white wines you'll ever try. It's high acid, it's low alcohol, but it has texture at the same time. It has like a creamy texture because it has lees aging and like that kind of oily quality to it. And being able to relate, and that's one of the cool things about the grid. Actually, it actually is pretty relatable to people. If you talk about body of wine, talk about acid, and talk about tannin, pretty quickly you can, to a person who's, they're like, I guess, you can get them to understand that terminology pretty quickly. And it's a great way to describe wines within your portfolio, right? But the level of nuance that we train for in the sense of smell and palate really has gotten me in tune at a really cool level with all of our producers. What prime example for me is Chateau Musar, right? Like the same vintage from day to day, I take notes, right? Not because the wines like are always fluctuating.
Indoctrinated by Serge, that's why. He indoctrinated you to drink 2 ounces every day for 2 weeks.
Yeah, well, you did do that, but it's also like you develop, like what the wine tastes like, right? You know how the acid should feel, how the tannin should feel, and you're like, you open it up one day, you're like, hey, there's something a little bit wonky here. Like there's something this is not how Musar acid is, right? And same thing with all your producers. It helps you talk to buyers, just like when you're working in restaurants. Although in this case, the buyers are working in retail or restaurant buyers themselves. And it helps you really have a closer relationship to the wines you represent, and then in turn have better conversations with the wineries that you represent and the people from the
Have the proprietors asked you for feedback in the American market? For example, Tyrrell's, I'm sure they aren't taking over the world yet as much as we'd like them to, mainly because of the style of Semillon from Hunter Valley and how it's got such great acidity, but at the same time, it's, kind of broad. Have they ever asked the question, well, we want to grow our business by 10 or 15%. Is there any feedback that you would give us about our wines in specific? And obviously we want to give us a diplomatic answer as possible, but is the American palate sometimes equates Semillon with residual sugar, and sometimes high acid wines are a shock. The American palate's moving towards high acid more and more, but still they like soft and sweet. And
yeah, I mean, I think it really, and I think that goes to the company I work for, right? At Broadbent, we tend to represent producers that what's the right way of putting it? They're kind of iconic producers from where they're from, but they're not the wines that people are drinking all the time, right? In the United States, not yet. We're working to make that happen, but but it's for example with Tyrrells, I do think that there are categories that people drink a lot of, like people drink a fair amount of Muscadet, at least on the East Coast. I don't spend as much time on the West Coast these days, right? And people drink a fair amount of Chablis. Hunter Valley Semillon kind of falls into that category. And again, that goes right back to blind tasting and deductive method, right? So when you are talking about like a Tyrrell Semillon, like, okay, so you have all these great Chablis on your list. You have these Muscadets on your list. You're a seafood restaurant. This is the perfect place for Hunter Valley Semillon because it falls into that textural area, it falls into the fruit area, and some secondary aromatic areas as well. So I think that's one of the things that those are the conversations that we have at Broadbent, and kind of the way that we approach going into the market is by viewing these wines, which are kind of unique, and putting them in perspective to the rest of the world of wine. And really, and I think Josh Orr on the West Coast can add to that as well. That is it's super useful, but also for what we do, it's vital.
We're going to talk to Josh in a couple of weeks about his opinion on how to sell Rhone wines, because, as one of the topics that, Bien Nacido has Syrah in, not only a single block, but also an estate blend that we make. You guys obviously have some wonderful wines from South Africa that are just incredible.
And we just started representing Georges Vernet, actually, too.
I mean, epic Cody Rohde monster, right? Yeah. And so you look at that where everyone from retail to restaurants to sommeliers to consumers, they all don't like Syrah. They all love it, but it's so hard to sell, And so Josh and I are going to have that conversation in a couple of weeks, and hopefully we can solve the world's problems on a half-hour show.
Yeah, and that's one of those things I've never understood, because it's such a distinctive grape. And if you look at something like Sauvignon Blanc, right? If you look at the average tasting note on Sauvignon Blanc, you're like, oh, this is one of the most popular grape varieties in the world. But you're like jalapeno pepper, like cilantro, grass, like all these things. You would never think that it would be on paper, right? But it is, and people love it. I love Sauvignon Blanc. And then Syrah, it's actually, I'm breaking into what Josh is going to talk about. So
now let's go back to the other side of this, though. Right. Take Sauvignon Blanc or take Syrah, whatever grape you'd like. Yeah. Imagine the skills that you have right now, and you're making dinner for your wife and your daughter, and you had a wine open first, and you want that wine to work well with the dinner that you're going to prepare. How have those skills of being able to open a bottle of Georges Vernet, to taste it? What does he make? The Blanc de Seigneur is one of his like classic cuvées. Yeah. You taste that wine, you get to recognize the acid, the structure, the fruit quality, the non-fruit characteristics, the tannic structure. How is that going to now make your life better for tonight's dinner? You're still going to go to the grocery store, and what are you buying, and how are you going to make that wine using your blind tasting ability? Yeah,
so let's do something. Let's look at the Coteau de Vernon, right? The Condrieu, which is, I think that it's super unique texturally, right? And it's actually pretty hard to get the right like food pairing for. So you're looking at an aromatic white wine, has oak. It's highly textured, full-bodied. It's still it's medium acid, but on like the verge of medium plus. And it is it has phenolic bitterness too, right? So that does kind of open up a wide variety of things, but it also narrows things down as well, right? For me, like automatically, I'd want to go for a like oily fish. That's the first thing that comes to my mind. So like something
or like shark, or how oily?
I was thinking mackerel, but since I'm also have to also cook for my wife and my daughter. I think I would have to go to salmon to be quite honest with you. But remind me on mackerel, because I have another great food and wine pairing thing on mackerel. And so let's say salmon for that matter. Okay, so we'll do pretty simple. But with that, you have the bitterness, right? So I want to do some like braised kale or braised collard greens. And I like actually cooking from flavor, so you have like all sorts of different cultural influences too. So braise that with just simple like olive oil and a little bit of salt, like just a little bit of citrus, and then a little bit of maple syrup. And that maple syrup and tune within that, like that will bring down the bitterness, but will also add a little bit of sweetness to go with the fruit. And then just do a really simple, to go to the richness of the wine, do like a really simple Beurre Blanc to go with it as well. So you have, I'll probably do like cedar plank. I'm going into a lot of detail, sorry.
No, that's perfect, because the cedar plank to me reminds me of the slight little oxidation that you get from something like Kundry as well, where it's not oxidative like burnt nut, it's more like oxidative like dried hay, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And
it makes perfect sense.
And that also goes in with that bit of oak in there as well, right? And then going from there, you have the Beurre Blanc, you have the greens. I probably just do like some quick new potatoes and like do some caramelized onions with that, put it all together, and that would, I think a nice addition might actually be some like toasted hazelnuts on top, and that would make it all kind of.
Plus, it would lend a little bit of bitterness, but in a different way too.
Yeah, and would also add the aromatic as well to it.
For me, that dish, I mean, immediately I think of this salad that we love to do this time of year with farro, bitter greens, grilled peaches, and then just a nice like homemade vinaigrette. And you can make the vinaigrette as sweet or as, you know, tart as you want to, right? Because we're making it at home. And it reminds me of that because the farro has a little bit of that brown flavor, for lack of a better term, right? That brown rice or oxidation kind of tone, which could lead to the oak. You have the peaches, which are very much a character of Viognier, but at the same time, you have the grilled character to bring in that bitterness and the caramelization of those peaches. You know, any bitter salad green are fantastic. I particularly like Radicchio because it has that noticeable bitter content that can really bring down the bitterness of a bitter wine.
Yeah.
And then you have whatever vinaigrette you want to make. I mean, right now, blood orange vinaigrette would be just amazing. Like, it would make your salad nice and colorful too, and like highlight the pinks and the oranges in your peaches. I mean,
I love it. That sounds good. So I have to ask you a question. Do you score your radicchio and put it on salt for a little bit before you cook it?
Oh, what does that do?
It actually brings down, it's like, I don't know if it's true, and it brings down the bitterness actually. So it's not as bitter.
And I'm particularly attuned to bitterness. And now that you're teaching a lot for the court, I'm sure you probably see this when you're helping students at the intro or certified. Are you particularly sensitive to bitterness yourself?
I'm sensitive to it, but at the same time, I also like it.
Right.
Yeah. So
because you've learned to balance it out so that you, like, I appreciate a black cup of coffee now when years ago I didn't. I still do like a little bit of sugar and a little bit of cream to make it perfect for myself, but I'm okay with it being black. The thing that I find a lot of sommeliers from whatever level, their understanding of phenolic bitterness is such a difficult character for them to be able to like hone in on. Sure, they can get new oak. It smells like toast and cocoa and coffee and mocha and vanilla. They get that. They are like, oh, great, I can pick out pyrazines, no problem. Maybe rotundone's a little more difficult, but they're getting there. But the phenolic bitterness thing is so difficult. And I, haven't found if everyone is on par with liking and disliking bitterness altogether. But for me, I don't like bitterness that much. So to me, when I pick up a phenolic wine, I'm like, this is bitter.
Yeah.
It's gotta be one of these things. And I tend to people who like IPAs, man, they are going to have a hard time because if they love Pliny the Elder, or they like Mickler 1000 IBU IPA, like they've blown out their palate for bitterness for years.
Yeah, but it's also, I mean, I do love IPAs. I do honestly love bitter. Like I'm probably a super alkaline person, from like all the kale and cauliflower and things like that I eat. But I find that just like tannin, for that matter, although they're different, people, if you just take the time to be with the wine. It sounds ridiculous, but take the time to be with the wine, and just kind of focus on how it is on your palate. After a while, you'll get the sensation, because it is. I mean, flavor, ultimately, all flavor is a sensation, right? So it's just a matter of really analyzing it and getting used to it. And if you really want to know what it feels like, just eat raw kale first thing when you wake up in the morning.
See, one of the big takeaways and why I wanted to have this conversation with you, and that I hope people who are going through their examinations, or even just learning the skill of deductive tasting, or we might as well call it blind tasting, right, can use, is that this should be an everyday skill. This should not just be Thursday morning at 10 o'clock when you're meeting with your tasting group, or nowadays if somebody dropped off wines at your house and you're all going to meet on Sundays on Skype. That this should be part of your daily routine. And I don't even necessarily mean popping a bottle of wine every day, because I don't pop a bottle of wine every day, but I do brush my teeth, and there's bitterness in toothpaste. I do, have a glass of orange juice sometimes after you brush your teeth, and that's a completely different experience. And taking the 1 or 2 seconds to think back, have I ever had a wine that made me think or feel that way? That will create those emotional connections in you that will allow you to do what you said and I did in my exam, where you, at some point, you just know it because you've looked at it every day. You didn't just look at it on Thursday tasting.
So one thing I've been doing a fair amount of kind of consumer tastings through different wine shops through this time period, right? And one of the things I'm big on is aromatic memory, and that everyone has aromatic memory, whether or not you know you're using it. It doesn't matter. You remember what breakfast smells like in your house growing up. You remember what it's like walking in the school in the morning when you're a kid, or the way that it smells out right before it rains, or the way like autumn leaves smell, or like leaves being burnt. All of those things, if you think about it, you know what they smell like, and if you smell it, you're like, oh, that's what that is.
Right.
This blind tasting is the same thing, or particularly from aromatics. And Will's totally right, you don't have to be tasting wine every day to do this. You can just be very attuned to your sense of smell. Go out on walks in the woods and be like, okay, cool. So how do pine needles smell when the sun's beating down on them?
Right.
How do mushrooms smell on the side of a log? How does the creek smell when it's going by, as opposed to when you're further away from the creek? There's all sorts of different, and if you go, and again, this sounds really geeky, but hey, I am a geek, that's all right. So I would call these they're like walks. They're almost like mindfulness walks, but where you're focused on your sense of smell. Mm-hmm. And I found those to be, or cooking too, and smelling every ingredient, those to be as useful sometimes to building up my memory of my smell memory. And then you relate that to the wines, right? That like the way when I'm tasting a red Burgundy, or like I'm tasting Gevrey Chambertin, I was like, yeah, those are black mushrooms on a log. And that comes into my head. I'm like, that's it. Or it's like, that is a roasted beetroot. And you know, like, and all of these, they come in as images when you're tasting the wines. But it's because I would go through and smell all these things. And
well, especially from the perspective that, look, we can't all drink Rousseau Chambertin, but if in your meal tonight, you can make some roasted beets, some black, you know, dark mushrooms that were with teriyaki sauce, and eat that for dinner. Hell, that reminds me of Rousseau Chambertin, and I might not be able to have Rousseau Chambertin tonight, but at least my brain can go, yeah, it reminds me of that time that I had Rousseau Chambertin. You know, like it all should feed back into each other, and I hope in good vibes, because there are many wines that I have gotten wrong, and there are many wines that I have gotten right. And you know what? I just want to leave with some positive memory about it, whether that was the one thing that you picked up and are able to bring it back in, or maybe something somebody else said. I mean, Douglas Kim, who's a master as well, he used to say root vegetables for any white Rhone varietal. I never thought of like turnips or carrots or any root vegetable.
Parsnips. Yeah, totally. Parsnips for like Marsan Roussan, and also Viognier, actually. Yeah, I totally. That was one of mine too, or is one of mine.
Well, this is awesome. I want to give you a chance to shout out any of the wines that you think people should taste from your portfolio. I will start with one that I really think everybody should try, Marco Cirillo. His Grenache. It's got the oldest Grenache vines in the world. It is incredible to try. Anything else people should look for that you're really loving right now from the Broadbent selections?
Yeah, definitely. I agree with Cirillo. Those are so great, man. Thank you for that. Yeah, Capana, just a Brunello producer we just started picking up. Phenomenal producer.
How's that spelled?
Capanna.
Okay.
Also, I always, my goal in life is to have more people drink Chateau Musar. So I already mentioned it, but yeah, that's I preach the word of Serge and Musar. And then also we picked up a new Chianti producer, which I'm really impressed with. And that's Bindi Sergardi, and they're from Chianti Classico, and they are awesome. They really make some fantastic wines.
Well, I wouldn't be able to do this with you today if it wasn't for the support of the Miller family and Bien Nacido and Solomon Hills Estates. So if any of you learned anything today, think about adding some of the Broadbent selections, or maybe some Bien Nacido and Solomon Hills to your wine list. Maximilian, you're great. I appreciate you.
Well, you're awesome, man. Thanks a lot. It's a lot of fun.
Thanks for joining.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. And tune in a couple weeks, or on next Tuesday, and we're going to get into a couple of cool other topics. Buddy.